Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Williams to Kansas.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. And greetings from the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C., where I come from. And it's good to be back out in reality in America, and it's good to be here with all of you. What a great group this is. I remember speaking a couple of other occasions. I'll tell you what, after that great introduction, I almost could sit down and we can do questions at this point. I think James hit all the important points already. Really the lesson from the Kansas experience that the rest of the country still needs to learn, and maybe a few people in Topeka still need to learn in terms of how to get this turned back around. But congratulations. I heard that this club won the Pachyderm of the Year Award recently nationally. So to the Johns and the leadership and all the attendees that make this possible, congratulations. It is really, really inspiring for me to see this kind of a community organization devoted around principle come together weekly and bring together people that are concerned about these issues going forward. And I'll tell you what, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and that's what it's going to take to get Kansas turned around when it comes to, I think we can all agree that these last 6 months and maybe the last 2 years are a time and place that we don't want to repeat the failures over this time. The taxpayers take it on the chin repeatedly with some of the biggest tax increases in state history. Now, going back to Nietzsche, of course, the saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? But you have to learn the lessons of the things that went wrong in order not to repeat them again. And I think that's really important, is what we are looking to do nationally, and certainly in Washington. We can spend a little time on this maybe later if you're interested in what's happening in Washington, but certainly in Kansas, is we need, and taxpayers need, to hit the reset button. We've gone through a very painful time where more and more has been expected of the hardworking taxpayers of the great state of Kansas, and there needs to be a fundamental reset. There needs to be some of these big picture items tackled from a policy perspective, and we're going to go through and walk through some of those big picture issues that's not just facing Kansas, but they're facing every single state across the country. And what we need is fundamentally a thought of how do we prioritize our budget? How do we make sure that government lives within its means? And we're going to talk through what's worked in other states on that. So it's a pleasure to be with you here. My organization is not a partisan organization. I'm kind of a just the facts man kind of guy to say what's working across the other states, what works. We have these great 50 laboratories of democracy, as Justice Brandeis once famously put it. We can learn a whole lot from what's going on around the country. In my last slide, I will sum up this presentation in a 10-second soundbite, which be prepared for when we get to that later. So I know many of you know my background and know the background of ALEC, but I think I should repeat it for some of you who are not familiar with ALEC. And I wanted to recognize a friend and a leader to the taxpayer community here in Kansas that's with us today, is our new ALEC State Chairman, Senator Ty Masterson from the Wichita area. Ty, thanks for being here. I tell you, being in the trenches, being in Topeka during those dark days this year and a couple of years ago when those tax increases were being foisted on us, people like Ty Masterson were leading the charge of free market, conservative, limited government legislators up there. He needs probably a few more friends up there these days, and I know that's all up to you. That's not my thing. But I'll tell you what, it's good to have you and good to have that core group of people fighting the good fight there. So we, as an organization, nonpartisan, but I tell you, all these principles that we talk about should be embraced by all major parties. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that right now, but they should be. These fundamental American principles: limited government, free markets, federalism. The idea that not all the decisions can and should be made in our nation's capital. They should be made in the areas of government that are closest to the people, the state capitals, the cities and counties across this great country. That, I think, is where we've gone off kilter as a nation. The federal government has certainly taken on way too much responsibility. Hopefully, under this Trump administration, we will indeed be able to drain the swamp and bring back some of those functions. But I'll tell you what that's going to mean. It's going to mean not just more ability to do things at the state and local level. It's going to mean a lot of tough decisions are going to need to be made at the state and local level. So be ready. That's what we're hearing out of Washington, is this administration is devoted to bringing back that power of government to state and local levels. But it's going to take all of us engaged in that process on a principled basis. So in Washington, right now we're looking at tax reform. We, in the next couple of months, may be considering one of the biggest tax changes in the last 30 years. It's been since 1986 that we've reformed our tax code in the nation's capital. Now the tax code, anybody know how long the tax code is? Yeah, it would take you a long time to count it. Let's just put it that way. It's over 4 million words long, the United States tax code. Each and every year, more than one change to the code per day is adopted on average. Over 450 changes per year we've averaged since the year 2000. Not only has that meant the tax burden has gotten more and it's gotten higher through Obamacare taxes and all the other taxes being levied, but the complication continues to get higher. And so for small business owners and individual taxpayers, that needs to change. And I think we've got a group of people committed to making that change in Washington. So let's get to the state level for a moment, because as I do like to say, at the federal level, we need to get it right, and we need to get the burden of big government off the backs of the states so they can get it right. Because until we see national growth of 3 or 4%, let's not forget, this is the weakest economic recovery coming out of an economic downturn since World War II that we've seen. This has been the recovery under President Obama. Somebody, I think it was Newt Gingrich, who was with us last week at the ALEC annual meetings, and he told us this: the best year of economic growth under President Obama was worse than the worst year of economic growth under Bill Clinton's 8 years in the 1990s. That's how much of a stagnant recovery we've had. And until we start to see federal growth, it's going to be very difficult for states to get under the issue of these budget deficits that now, by the way, more than 30 states had. It's not just Kansas that went through a budget deficit, by the way. It's all these states that didn't cut taxes in the last few years. It's states that haven't cut taxes in a decade or a generation that face budget problems because of the weak federal recovery and because of commodity prices being in the tank in a lot of places. So don't let the opponents of tax cuts get away with saying that we have budget deficits in Kansas because of tax cuts. That's absolutely not the case. And as James said, the 10-second takeaway out of the Kansas experiment that we're now talking about in federal tax reform, as opponents of federal tax reform are trying to say, well, look at what tax cuts did to Kansas, so President Trump, you're not going to be able to cut taxes nationally because you're going to ruin our economy. The 10-second takeaway is you can't cut taxes without keeping spending under control. That is the lesson to be learned. And I will say, traveling to all 50 states now, writing the Rich States, Poor States book, talking with so many state legislators that want to do the right thing, the well has been poisoned by the idea that tax cuts have done a disservice to Kansas. And I think it's going to be a years-long, if not a decade-long, piece for me, for Senator Masterson, for all of you around this room to tell the proper and accurate story and the accounting of what happened actually in Kansas. That tax cuts were good. We saw some very positive results early on. The spending cuts didn't match it. You had some very weak economy because of the federal part of it. That was a problem. But at the end of the day, tax cuts work. And we'll go through some of the numbers of why they work. In the states, for instance, that go without personal income taxes, the states that keep tax and spending low, we'll go through some of those examples here in some of the slides. But first of all, as I mentioned, we need a reset when it comes to our philosophy of government. Where does that start? The reset starts when it comes to looking at the size, the scope, and the core functions of government. What is it that government should be doing? What does it exist to do? What are the things that could be done in the private sector? We used to call it the Yellow Pages test. Does anybody here still use the Yellow Pages? Probably a few. Not many, not like we used to. Now we almost could call it the Google test. As if a product or service is done in the private sector through a private sector service provider, chances are it's done at a lower cost and a higher quality that can be done in the government. So here are 5 dangerous questions when we're going into states to say, how do we have that budget reset to make sure we right-size government? Because after all, let's not forget, the private sector needs to be the one that funds the public sector. And you cannot have a public sector fundamentally and for a long period of time outgrow a private sector and expect that it's going to work. So to get to that budget reset, here are the 5 questions. First, what is the role of government? We try to do a lot of things. Is it the right level of government? Where should it be done? Should it be done at all? Secondly, what are the essential services government must do to fulfill its purpose? Core functions, needs versus wants. These are discussions if you're a business owner or family budgeting around your kitchen table that you ask all the time. Is it a need? Is it a want? How much revenue? How much resources do we have? What do we spend it on to maximize our value? Next, how do we know if government's doing a good job? Ooh. That's a big one. And that's a question that if you're in the private sector, if you don't ask that question consistently, you're in big trouble. What does success look like? That's a question, and Senator Masterson can tell you, a lot of his colleagues don't ask that question. I know he asks that question. What should all of it cost? And then when cuts must be made, And we know we always have the boom and bust cycle of the economy, right? That we're not going to get away from that. As the famous philosopher and occasional baseball player, Yogi Berra, would say, it's like deja vu all over again. You know, we have these boom periods of the economy, we have these bust periods, but government goes on and assumes that there'll never be another bust. They assume the most rosy of projections when it comes to pensions or when it comes to spending. But when cuts must be made, how will they be properly prioritized? One of the biggest threats, which I think is coming not just to Kansas, but every state capital is, and it needs to happen, when the government at the federal level starts to cut back its support of state and local governments. What do? There was this debate here in Topeka, there was this debate in many state capitals across the country on Medicaid expansion, expanding Obamacare to working age able-bodied adults. And expanding that population because this idea, you've all heard it, the free federal dollars, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch, except when you're a speaker at the Pachyderm today, and I really appreciate that, John. But I'll tell you, outside of that, it doesn't exist in this world, right? And so that's a big one coming. What do you do when that cut happens? I wouldn't want to be the legislator that's on the watch when the federal match goes from 100 to 90% to 50% on Medicaid, and all of a sudden, if you want to keep those people on the rolls, you've got to come up with your own state sources. Some states are now contingency planning to say, when those cuts happen, how will we properly prioritize? And I think that's one of the big pieces that whoever the next governor is after 2018 and after the new legislators come in 2018 and 2020, and that reset happens, that's a question that we need to get in front of. Here's a wonky one, and I'm a tax economist. We get a bad rap as being really boring, wonky people. But here's a wonky one even for us, and that is the biggest threat to state finances is unfunded pension obligations. Now, there's been some work done in Kansas on this topic, but don't let anyone tell you that the problem is solved here in Kansas. There's a lot more to be done. There's a reason, ladies and gentlemen, that 90% of the private sector is in 401k style defined contribution retirement plans, and about the exact inverse of that, about 90% of state and local workers nationally are in defined benefit pension plans that are unaffordable, they're not being funded properly, and those kind of risks threaten not only taxpayers, but they threaten the very workers and retirees they exist to produce resources for. And this is an issue that, you know, even for us policy wonks, goes way into the weeds. A lot of times you start talking pension obligations and people start needing to go and answer phone calls and use the restroom and taking an exit. So I'm used to it. I'm glad we've got a very engaged crowd here because nobody's actually gotten up after I mentioned pensions. But here's a slide that would keep me up at night if I was a state legislator. This is, nationally speaking, the average contribution into the state pension systems, starting in 2001, going to the present, has gone from about 7% of payroll to about 19% of payroll nationally. So even as people say, well, we're okay funded, you know, we did pension obligation bonds or we went to a cash balance part of a system, these contributions continually to go up. And I know Ty probably knows the answer to this, but when you're talking to your elected officials in Kansas, ask them, how much have pension costs gone up in the last 10 or 15 years? Even though they say we're well funded in Kansas and a lot of people, I don't buy that, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Ask what this looks like in Kansas and how much as a percentage of the budget now goes to pensions versus 15 years ago. And it's a scary number. For the next governor to be successful and resetting the budget and also having a chance to cut taxes again and roll back a lot of these damaging tax increases, this is one of those issues that is going to be a big ticket item to address. If it's not addressed, it's going to be very difficult to be successful in some of the other areas. But there's good news here in that, A, we've had some really good successes at the state level on pension reform. Just in the last month, and we had a presentation on this last week, my home state of Michigan and Pennsylvania reformed pensions and moved to a 401k style model. And if it can be done in Michigan and if it can be done in Pennsylvania under a Democrat governor, Tom Wolf, by the way, who's not a conservative Democrat, it can certainly be done in a state like Kansas. They realize it's not sustainable to continue down the current path because it threatens both spending. If you're kind of a big spender, it threatens more spending in areas of government, but it also threatens the idea that we can keep taxes low. And don't just take my word for it, because I've actually got a national poll of about 1,000 Americans that were asked a series of questions, and I know it's hard to read on this, so I'll go through a couple of the top line numbers. of how Americans feel about the pension crisis. Because as painful as it was, the Detroit bankruptcy, the Puerto Rico restructuring situation, Illinois, and some of the difficulties they've had, what those situations have done has raised awareness of this fundamental financial threat facing states on pension costs. So today, 72% of Americans are concerned about pension costs. That's remarkable, considering how in the weeds this issue is, that 72% of Americans care about it. 2/3 of Americans would like to shift new hires into 401ks. So as you're starting this debate, whether it's 2019, whether it's 2021 in Kansas when you have a reset, this is something to really keep in mind, is people want pension reform. Now, people will say it's only right-wing Republicans talking about this and we're making up this issue. So I thought I would highlight my favorite right-wing Republican, Rahm Emanuel, former chief of staff to President Obama. Never let a good crisis go to waste, Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago. Chicago's not a conservative city, by the way. Mayor Rahm Emanuel said, "Our taxpayers cannot afford to choose between pensions and police officers or pensions and paved streets." It's getting to the issue that if pension costs are not addressed, it's going to threaten public spending on very important areas of core government services. Now, finally, if you're talking about this issue and you say, well, I agree with you, Williams, but I don't know if I really take your word for it alone, don't take my word for it. It's completely fine with me. Trust me. Take this guy's word for it. And this is Judge Stephen Rhodes. He was the judge this is a 25-year capstone of his legal career. He presided over the Detroit bankruptcy. And if there's one thing, can we all agree that we don't want our community to be the next Detroit, right? If you're talking with your liberal aunt or uncle or your family at Thanksgiving, I think we can all agree upon that nobody wants to be the next Detroit. So follow Judge Rhodes' 3 takeaways. First, make your pension contributions if you have one. Make sure you're calculating your liability properly. There's this issue in government where Kansas today assumes more than, 7.75 assumed rate of return in its pension system. Not just this year, not just this next year, but every year for the next 10 to 20 years. They're assuming they're going to earn 7.75. Anybody here want to sign up to invest my money at 7.75? Because I'll take you on the spot if you can assure that risk-free. That's basically what Kansas taxpayers are assuring risk-free for the pension system. You know, it was nice when that world existed 20 years ago with the tech boom. That world doesn't exist anymore, that you can assume that kind of rates of return. So when you see the numbers that tell you have pension liabilities, ask them what they assume when they give you those numbers too, because I guarantee you they're assuming that 7.75 rate of return. The average corporate plan is 4.7 assumed rates of return. You move Kansas into that needle in that direction, all of a sudden you've got a world of hurt where you're looking a lot more like Illinois than you'd like to. So tax policy, let's talk through the reset on taxes that needs to happen when we have real leadership on the issues here to move Kansas in the right direction. First of all, here are the principles of tax policy. And these are important principles. And in my view, every decision, and I've done this for a dozen years, traveled all 50 states, and when elected officials can start on a set of principles, they might not agree on all of them, but if they can start and govern on principle versus the political winds of the day, you see those states making the most headway when it comes to pro-taxpayer policies and keeping taxes low and fair and neutral across the board. So first of all, simplicity. Transparency, those are pretty straightforward principles. The third, neutrality, you might ask, what in the world is neutrality on tax policy? It's basic fairness, and that is in a lot of cases, it happens here, it happens in Washington, it happens in states across the country. People want to use the tax code to pick winners and losers. That is fundamentally bad tax policy, and it's wrong. And we are standing up to that everywhere we go. It's not a popular stance because those that don't vote for these kind of special tax breaks, and we call it cronyism in a lot of cases, maybe they don't get invited to the cocktail party circuit. Maybe they aren't the popular folks around the state capitol because they have the principles to say no, because that's not the right way to compete. There's lots of ways that you can compete, but not by giving special handouts to one firm or another or one company or industry over another. That's not the right way to compete. Competing through the free market where everybody plays by the same rules and has the same way to compete with each other is the way to go. And the highlight I like to use on this is the state that has probably competed the most through cronyism is New York State. And they're some of the highest taxes in the nation. And they've been running these TV ads. Have you seen the TV ads? They've run these TV ads nationwide saying, come into New York for a good place to do business. Now, I thought about this for a little while after I saw the first ad, and Bloomberg or some news outlet called me and asked for a comment. And I said, well, first of all, I guess, it's good that they realize that taxes matter and that they're realizing they need to keep tax costs down. But secondly, if you need to run a national ad campaign of about $50 million to say, come into our state to do business, you're probably not a very good state to do business in the first place. Secondly, though, you have to ask the question, is it successful? And the grand total of the first year of this experiment, get ready for this. This is government success for you right here. $50 million spent on a national ad campaign. The grand total of jobs created, 76. A grand total of 76 jobs for $53 million spent. That's according to the government's own accounting, right? So they're not hiding anything there. That's the raw facts. That's not how you compete. You compete through low taxes across the board. And when you reset the Kansas tax system, the Brownback tax cuts in that fight and then the subsequent tax increases and more tax increases, we need to reset and start from scratch. So when you start from scratch, let's look at the states that do it well versus the states that don't do it well. And one of the ways, I think probably the best way, as an economist, I look at revealed preferences. When people decide to move from one state to another, or businesses decide to start up in one state versus another, it gives you a pretty good idea of where the most hospitable places are to live and have economic opportunity. So when you look at the last 10 years of data that we know, when people move from one state to another, where are they going and where are they leaving? And I think it asks some pretty good takeaways for a state like Kansas that wants to get it back together again. Because let's not forget, when this experiment started, it was even before the Brownback tax cuts. I remember working with Senator Masterson with SB 1, the March to Zero, the idea that we need to get the taxes down as much as possible on income. That was a great idea. We need to go through that again to say, how do we get there in a way that we can do it while balancing the budget, prioritizing spending, covering some of these big costs? Because two of the biggest winners in this experiment when it comes to where Americans are moving, where businesses are going, Texas and Florida. Other than being big states with pretty good sports programs, what do they have in common? Right. We have a very, very good crowd here. We know that Texas and Florida are two of the 9 states that don't tax personal income. And that's a big drawing card. It really is for those states. And you look at North Carolina, been one of the states that has most aggressively cut taxes and kept budgets under control over the last 5 years. They're number 3. Arizona and Georgia both fall into that philosophy of limited government, low tax model. You look at the other side of the equation, the state to lose the most over the last 10 years, New York's lost almost 1.5 million Americans to the other 49 states with some of the highest taxes, and despite this national gimmicky ad campaign to say come in and do business in our state through cronyism. That doesn't work. California should be bursting at the seams. They are probably the most valuable piece of real estate in the world. They have Silicon Valley and the economic engine that is. They have all kinds of great things going for them with the beaches and all the amenities of California, but yet there's something awry in California that California now has lost more than 1.2 million over the last 10 years to the other 49 states. It is that liberal elected officials in Sacramento have basically committed economic malpractice in California now for decades, and it's driven to what should be America's booming piece of the economy into really an economic basket case in a lot of places. And don't take my word for it. Once again, that's going to be a common theme today, is do not take my word for it. Take liberal Democrat Governor Jerry Brown of California, who just admitted publicly that over-reliance on income taxes and the kind of boom and bust cycle through the budget that creates has made it almost impossible to have a completely balanced budget and a sustainable budget for California. That's a case study of what not to do. And then you get on that list, Illinois, my home state of Michigan, New Jersey, states that have really had a trouble over the last decade retaining and attracting businesses and individuals because of their policies. Now you look at, these are pretty big numbers, but what does that mean? I have to admit I'm a Michigan football fan. Anybody here, Wolverine, go blue? Okay, so largest stadium in the country, the Big House. If anybody's been there, you feel really small when you're there. That's about 113,000 people, give or take. We're the largest in the country. We have this little war with Tennessee that we're always adding a seat or two here to try to one-up each other. But when you're there, that's about 100,000 people. Consider that some of these states have lost 15 stadiums full of taxpayers over the last 10 years alone. That's a lot of people that have left. And it's not just the idea that these people are moving. It's the idea of what are they taking with them. They're taking their talent, they're taking their economic opportunity, they're taking their job creation potential to other states. And by the way, if they're concerned about tax revenue, they're taking their tax revenue with them to other states. So while they're going to places like Texas and Florida that don't charge a personal income tax, they're paying property taxes, they're paying sales taxes, and they're paying all the other things that they need to fund state government and local government with in those places. And by the way, as we're going to talk about in a second, they take their contributions with them, charitable contributions. This is something that we as conservatives don't talk about nearly enough. I'm a big fan. Anybody a fan of Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute? I mean, he is one of the best conservative communicators there is today. And one of the things that he always talks about is the morality of capitalism and the idea that our ideas are not good just because of the principle. They're good because they're good for people. They mean better outcomes and better opportunity for people at all income levels. We get accused of being, supportive of just business for the rich. That's bogus. Our policies are the policies that lift people out of poverty. They're the policies that give people the opportunity in this free society to become better off and to become better off than their parents or their grandparents' generations. And one of the ways to do that is when people are successful. I was driving down the road the other day and I just got a smile on my face when I saw, I think the local YMCA along the highway was the Koch Center at the YMCA. And it's like when people are successful, they invest back into the community. When you think of a community like Wichita, I mean, without the investments of the business community, people that have been successful to sow back into the community, what would you be well behind of where you're at today in terms of development? Now, when people leave, they take those contributions with them. So, for instance, the study that I did is we looked at what taxes matter for charitable contributions. And it turns out they matter a lot. And taxes matter a lot because when people leave, let's say New Jersey, one of the states with the big out-migration that we talked about, there was a study after they had an income tax increase on quote-unquote millionaires. They defined that at $250,000 of income, by the way. I haven't quite figured out the math of that. That must be Common Core math or something like that. But, they take their contributions. So a millionaire or a billionaire leaves New Jersey, and all of a sudden they're supporting the Boys and Girls Club of Florida and their church or their synagogue in Florida, and not their church or not the Boys and Girls Club of New Jersey. And there's a real effect there that people don't measure. We just look at the dollars and cents of it from a revenue perspective. We don't take in consideration really the fabric of it from a moral sense, what it means to enhance economic opportunity, and what that means for community, charitable giving to help the poor as well. So when we look at what's coming up next, these states that have seen the out-migration, they're going to have it worse. And I think Kansas is also going to be in a much worse shape because of the big tax increases that just happened. You're getting closer to that model of Illinois and California and further away from the model of Texas and Florida by what just happened. And that's why there needs to be that reset that we've talked about. Here's the scary thing. If it wasn't bad enough for the high tax states already, there was this poll done recently that I found was just remarkable. And it would keep me up at night if I was a policymaker in some of these high-tax states. Nearly 50% of the residents of Connecticut and New Jersey would leave the state today if given the opportunity. That's after the huge out-migration that these states have already seen. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the cost of what high taxes and not prioritizing the spending will do for a state economy. And that's pretty scary. So getting to the kind of taxes that matter the most, as I mentioned, Florida and Texas, you identified correctly on our quiz earlier that they're two states without personal income taxes. Here are the 9 states without personal income taxes versus the 9 states that have the highest income taxes. And if you look down the line, you can tell the states without personal income taxes, whether it's GDP growth, population growth, tax receipt growth, or job growth, they're all outperforming the high tax states. This is, as my co-author Art Laffer of the book Rich States, Poor States says, this isn't rocket surgery, folks. This is economics 101. It really is. You don't need an advanced degree in economics to understand this. This is human interaction. It's human action. When policy changes, people change their behavior, and we have absolutely seen this play out across the 50 states. So to get to where Kansas ranks in relation to the other 49 states today, right now, here's the top 10 in rich states, poor states, and what we rank economic outlook based on taxes and labor and other policies. And what we find is Utah's number 1, Indiana, North Carolina, North Dakota, Tennessee round out the top 5. Get it to the bottom 10 here. New York, once again, that model of high tax and cronyism is not working well for New York. Vermont, New Jersey, California, Connecticut round out the bottom 5. Now, you might say, well, Kansas is neither top 10 or bottom 10, so where does it fall? Kansas right now is at 26th. Now, there's a couple of important points to make here to explain that a little bit more and put it in context. First of all, nothing that happened this year in terms of the anti-taxpayer policies and the largest tax increase in state history, they're not included in that ranking yet because we take what was existing in January 1st of the year and to compare the states. And so everything that happened after January 1st with all that bad outcome of what happened in Topeka is not included. So Kansas is going to fall in the rankings from 26. Now, looking at historically, now that we've done this for 10 years, and the books that you have at your tables, you can trace back Kansas' historic ranking. When we started out, and legislators here and Governor Brownback started out talking about ways to make Kansas more competitive, Kansas fell roughly middle of the pack. And nobody was content with that. And you look at, I guess it's all changed. They've changed all these sports conferences. It used to be the Big 12 index that we used to talk about to say, how does Kansas rank versus Oklahoma and Missouri and Nebraska and other states in the region? And Kansas didn't do very well, so people said, we need to do better. And let's look at ways to make Kansas more competitive. So Kansas went all the way from the mid-20s to number 11 in terms of economic outlook in rich states, poor states after the tax cuts. After 2015 tax increases, after 2017, it's probably likely to say Kansas is going to fall in the mid-30s by next year in rich states, poor states because of the huge backtrack that we've seen. Now, there's a couple of things that Kansas still does well on in our ranking. Having no state death tax, that was something we worked on in some of my first trips out here 12 so years ago. Being a right-to-work state is certainly helpful. But recently legislated tax changes, there were only 4 or 5 states in the nation that raised taxes more than Kansas did, and that was before the 2017 tax increases here in Kansas. Public employees as a percentage of the population. This is one when you look at, and I hope you take a chance to look at the books that you've got on the table, there's only 2 states in America that have more public employees as a percentage of their population than Kansas does. That considers state and local employment. There needs to be a reset, as we've discussed. There cannot continue that relationship where government is so big and the private sector is struggling to rebound from some of the national challenges that we have. And then, there is a huge decline from number 11 to number 26 that we've seen in rich states, poor states. Now, let me give you another resource. Instead of just the book that you have in front of you, we just created a brand new website that's interactive. So I encourage you all to go to richstatespoorstates.org. And it allows you, one of the neat things that it does is it allows you to go through and plug and play, if you were governor, or if you were speaker, or if you were Senate president, what would your agenda be, and how would it change Kansas's competitiveness? So you can go in, type in a new tax rate that you would like to see, type in some other policy changes, and see what it does dynamically in our rich states, poor states model relative to the other states. It's a great new way to really empower you to go out to say, what is the policy set that you want to see from your future leaders here in Kansas as we approach this reset? So let me end with 2 quick takeaways from states that you don't want to be like. And then we'll get to your questions and talk about the reset and what that means for Kansas here. First of all, Connecticut. Connecticut is a state that was about 25 years ago a no-income tax state. A lot of people really are surprised when I say that, but looking back to 1990, no-income tax state. They have grown spending tremendously since they adopted the income tax because, by the way, folks, tax increases fuel future spending increases, which is part of the problem. It's this vicious cycle that when you give the beast more to spend, they figure out more ways to spend it and then want more from us. That's happening absolutely in Connecticut. And recently, I don't know if you followed the news, Connecticut lost just about a month ago Aetna Insurance Company, which was based in Connecticut for a very long time. They had been warning they're going to leave if they keep raising taxes. And last year, they lost that little small business called General Electric that left Connecticut and went to Massachusetts. Now, there's a joke there, ladies and gentlemen. If you're losing companies to Massachusetts for lower taxes, you've got big problems as a state to try to get your economic house in order. But here's what Daniel Malloy, a liberal Democrat, so don't take my word for it. Once again, Daniel Malloy from Connecticut said, I've raised taxes multiple times and it's not working. Spurring economic growth is what's necessary. That is the chairman of the DGA, the Democrat Governors Association, Daniel Malloy, realizing the error in their ways in Connecticut of this tax and spend model. So don't be like Connecticut. And finally, to summarize up 10 years of research, traveling the 50 states, and working with 2,000 elected officials on rich states, poor states, and the project and our research in this area, I can sum up our research now into one slide. And here's the second version of it. Don't be like Illinois. I don't know if anybody saw what happened in the last month. They just raised taxes by 32% on individuals. This is a state that, as I like to describe it, has an 89-cent problem. You might be asking, what in the world do you mean by an 89-cent problem, Williams? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to tell you. 89 cents out of every new dollar that has gone to public education over the last 5 years statewide in Illinois has gone to pension costs and has not gone to the classroom. It's not gone to teacher salaries. It's not gone to textbooks. It's not gone to all those things that we're told we need to spend more education money on. It's not gone to the things that your Supreme Court, for instance, is always meddling and telling you what to spend more money on. It's not going on to the things that teachers' unions tell you need to spend more money on. It's going to pension costs. And until they figure that problem out, and until Kansas gets ahead of the problem on pension costs and doesn't go down that road of Illinois, we've got a long way to go on fixing that. That's something that should bring all of us together, whether you're education advocates and want to spend more on education. That should threaten you. That should terrify you. If you want to get Kansas taxes under control, pension costs should terrify you, because that's the big ticket item that whoever is the next governor that comes in 2019, hopefully they have fiscally responsible majorities in the legislature to be able to govern and have this reset that we need. That's one of the biggest things that needs to be tackled, ladies and gentlemen, today. So once again, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you to the Johns and to this group for putting it together. Keep fighting this fight, because what it's going to take is eternal vigilance from people like you to stay engaged in what's happening in Topeka, because this state needs a reset when it comes to public policy making, and you're going to make that happen. Thanks very much.
As always, I'll take the questions, hands up high, and I'll try to get around.
Sir, is it possible that the public sector could state to the retirees that we don't have the money, you're going to get 80 cents on the dollar? Now, on the private side, a big airline did that 20 years ago. Their pilots, they said, you're getting 60 cents, and that happened.
Well, I think what we're seeing is, that's a good question. There has been some movement in some states to voluntarily buy out people that want to say, I'll take the money right now up front and take a percentage of that. Most of the pension reform that we're seeing in the country deals with new hires alone, because depending on the state, there's contractual rights, there's constitutional protections for current pensioners and current retirees. And, you know, in a lot of cases, we want to keep that promise that's been made if possible. Now, if they want to voluntarily take some sort of deal, that's an option. But it's interesting to see that even unions in their pension plans, for instance, the Boeing Machinists Union out in Washington State, a very liberal organization, just voted voluntarily of the union members to move to a defined contribution type system. So I think people are seeing the writing on the wall. The way that the economy has moved over the last decade or two, you know, this is a completely different economy than was in the 1990s or 1980s, where you could invest in treasuries and get your rates of return that you need in your pension system to keep it afloat. Those don't exist anymore unless you're trying to go after some really risky investments. Also, the millennial class, I don't know how many of you employ millennials that are in their 20s today. They don't stay with one job like their parents or their grandparents' generation did. They're going to be moving around through entire careers. And so it's a really good shift to say we need to make sure we empower them to be owners of their own assets through kind of new system of employment and compensation. This has really shifted, and a lot of politicians have not kind of kept up to where the market has gone, unfortunately, when it comes to compensation.
Michigan's, as I understand it, talked quite a bit about it, is the only state that has a value-added tax. Can you tell us anything about how that's worked and what their experience is, and is it an example for other states and or the federal government?
So yeah, the idea was Michigan had an experiment with a quasi gross receipts, quasi value added tax. That was repealed. So today Michigan does not have that in existence anymore because it was a big issue. It was a problem, an economic drag in Michigan in a lot of cases. They repealed it. It was kind of a 20 or 30 year process to get rid of it. And this is there could be some issues. Everyone here familiar with the concept of value added gross receipts taxes. So it's not based necessarily necessarily on income as much as it is receipts coming in or value created. One of the issues that we had with it was it's a very complicated system. If you're a multi-state company and you're trying to do business in many, many states, if you're the only state that has this kind of regime when you're used to complying with the corporate income tax system elsewhere, it creates some issues in terms of compliance. Secondly, though, it's a really easy way for government to raise revenue, and they do it in a sneaky way. They get to say, well, it's a really low rate, but they're going to raise a ton of money through it, and all it takes is to tweak up the rate a little bit, and there's a lot of money that comes in. And then thirdly, the issue is it picks winners and losers a lot of times, and that depending if you're a vertically integrated industry or typically not, if you're a high margin industry versus a low margin industry, there's lots of ways that some get better treatment than others under that kind of regime. So Washington State has a similar regime, the B&O tax they call it, and they've created like 50 different rates based on the industry classification just so they can try to get around these problems. My thought generally is if you need to create like 50 separate rates and regimes based on the industry classification, you probably ought to avoid that kind of a system just on the grounds of simplicity. But, you know, Michigan got rid of it. That was one of the I think the economic drags on Michigan that we had the single state recession, if you all remember, in the last decade. Michigan now has turned the corner, luckily. Right to work, which I never thought in my lifetime as a Michigan resident and native that would happen. Business tax reduction, getting rid of that tax that was in existence. So Michigan has now turned the corner. So, you know, I think there's an optimistic note. As some of you know, I tried to be the eternal optimist, and it's really hard in Washington surviving that way now for a decade or more. But I mean, I think on the optimistic side is if it can be done in Michigan, it can be turned around, they can have a reset in Michigan, and it's been successful, and we've seen real results. It can be done in Kansas and many other states around the country.
I understand that Article 5 convention states was part of the topic at the recent convention, and so how do we in Kansas get that over the hump here and get our legislature and the legislative leaders specifically on board to help get that past Kansas?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think this, the Article 5 movement and the issue of bringing state autonomy back has been really an outgrowth of the federal government ignoring states in the proper relationship of federalism. And I think it's been ever really since the progressive movement of Woodrow Wilson, the 17th Amendment and the direct election of senators, the 16th Amendment allowing a federal government to have the ability to tax income for the first time being constitutional. There has been a long migration away from a proper balance of federalism between state and federal government. I mean, let's not forget that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution has been completely subverted by a whole host of court rulings after the Progressive Era and the New Deal and the Great Society. So I think, you know, people were fed up by that, and they said the current system's not working, so we should go and try this approach that Congress, or the Constitution gave us, Article 5, which allow then states to come together and put together things like the Balanced Budget Amendment is one of the ideas, the Convention of States, term limits, for instance, which of course was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, so a lot of people want to go the Article 5 approach. We'll see. I think the history of looking at Article 5 movements is that generally when the states get there and close to ratification, or at least close to calling a convention to propose amendments, Congress gets their act together pretty quickly, and they say, we don't want to necessarily give all this power to the states, so let's try to keep them happy in some regard. So, you know, there's been a lot of movement on the Balanced Budget Amendment. There's been a lot of movement on Convention of States. We'll see. Maybe the Trump administration is what it needs to have that reset done through regular order in Washington. Maybe I'm too optimistic, and that's not going to happen. And this movement, I think, will gain steam once again, especially if a new set of characters comes into power in Washington.
Here with Aaron.
Do you have any idea where we can get a list of the representatives, specifically the quote-unquote Republicans that voted for this tax increase? Is there a list?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure there is. And you could probably talk to Senator Masterson. You could talk to any number of groups in this room that probably have that pretty handy. That's absolutely an interesting list to look at after a lot of different votes that they were on record for, certainly.
Any other members with a question before I open it up to guests? Okay, well.
Jonathan, one of the biggest items on the spending side is education. And we have now, just last Tuesday, had a court hearing on Canada asking for another $900 million to $1.7 billion. Now, my question is, what other states have been able to control costs on education, have been able to look for cost benefit, and have actually put that back inbox and said, let's do a better job of educating the kids rather than just keep asking for more.
Yeah, you know, that's really one of the existential issues that's going to face whoever comes in the next 2 to 4 years and to work on this reset is fundamentally you have a judicial branch that is way outside of its constitutional rights, and they are trying to appropriate through litigation. They have basically tried to subvert the appropriations process and division of powers, and I think it's going to take, quite honestly, a lot of conviction and a lot of leadership to stand up and say, that's not your place. And we've seen it in a couple of other states. Not to the extent that we should have, though. This is a problem that's it's really an issue. I mean, the same firm, I remember, Augenblick and Myers, was it, that was going around peddling these studies. They went to all the other states using these kind of blown out of proportion estimates on what was needed for adequate education. They're taking advantage of things that were maybe meant for the right reasons in state constitutions, but have been subverted by kind of this national campaign of people trying to go off and argue for this, and of course benefit a lot in terms of writing these studies and getting the benefits from being hired by states to argue for this. So I think, first of all, it's going to take a legislature and a governor to say, know your place, you're the judicial branch, and this is not your place in terms of appropriation. Secondly, though, I think to your point is there needs to be more choice. There needs to be more abilities to folks to educate, whether it's homeschooling, private school, charter school, other opportunities outside of the regime that exists today. And I'm a big believer in that. You know, you look at Washington, D.C., we spend about $30,000 per pupil in K-12. Our graduation rates are abysmal. People say they're graduating, they can't function in reading, writing, and math. We're spending tons of money, and buildings are falling apart. My personal story, my church that we worship in, we used to rent a Washington, D.C. public school facility to have our Sunday morning services. We, during a worship session, had drywall and plaster fall from the ceiling because their maintenance was not up to snuff. And we're spending $30,000 for every pupil, not seeing the results we have, and having buildings fall apart. That is because we have lost our focus of education and not be student focused and not be parent focused, and we're supporting this system instead of supporting kids and supporting parents. That needs to change.
We'll open it up for some guest questions now.
Yes, there was rather spotty evidence that the tax cuts stimulate economic growth, but there's one thing that's very sure. The tax cuts lead to public debt, and the 2012 tax cuts in Kansas led to what was actually the biggest tax cut in state history in 2015 when they raised the sales tax, they cut exemptions, and I wondered why you would say that the 2017 tax increases would actually put the taxes back where they were in 2012. Were a biggest tax increase in state history rather than the 2015 tax increases were, which all the state's newspapers said were the biggest tax increases in state history.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't put a lot of stock in all the state newspapers necessarily, given their record of accuracy. But secondly, you look at the academic evidence, you look at the evidence from the states, and tax cuts absolutely work. You need to give them time to work, though, and that's the issue, is people look at expectations of future ability to earn profits and make a living and have economic opportunity in one state versus the other, and the tax cuts were in part and in effect for so short a time that perhaps some messaging errors were given in the original part of that to say it's going to be an immediate shot of adrenaline. The truth of the matter is it's 3 to 5 years is the average based on our academic evidence that tax cuts start to take effect and you start to see the real economic growth effects of the tax cuts. It was only, 2-3 years later, and you had a huge tax increase that complicated the situation and really muddied the waters. And so based on the evidence that we follow from the 50 states and the years of academic evidence that we have is tax cuts absolutely work, especially when you cut taxes on income and you cut taxes on productivity and economic opportunity like that. And so I'd say the question of, I think we did not obviously, deal with the spending side of the equation very effectively in Kansas. That's been a problem in many other states. And so in terms of adding to the state debt, that's the real culprit there is that, if you're going to go down the path, and you absolutely should, of making Kansas a more competitive state and the economy more more healthy and more competitive, you have to be willing to come up with the spending reductions and discipline on that side of the equation. And that's how you do it in a balanced way. And I'd point everybody to the North Carolina case study, where they've cut taxes more aggressively than Kansas has, yet they have a huge budget surplus. They have a AAA bond rating. They just raised teacher pay for the second time in 2 years because they did it right. And they balanced the fundamental cost of government with tax reductions.
The federal government, the Federal Reserve has consistently been holding interest rates down. Does this have any correlation between, you mentioned 7.5% versus 4.5%, and is this actually impacting the great middle class, their ability to save for their future?
Well, there's no doubt about it. I mean, this period has not been good for savers, and that's something that's probably going to change. I mean, there's no way that interest rates stay as low as they have been for a long period of time. We've started to see Chairman Yellen at the Fed start to move those rates up in a very slight way, I guess, recently. And a lot of people thought that needed to happen a lot sooner. We've been pumping all this money into the economy, really testing the limits of what we know to be true in terms of world economies and how much they could prop up $20 trillion of debt with quantitative easing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we keep going on that sense. When does inflation kick in? When do the bills come due? Luckily, we have retained this kind of easy money policy and not seen a huge inflation effect yet. But I mean, I think a lot of that is being built into prices, for instance. You don't necessarily see it all the time, but we are, I think we're kind of pushing the limits here. And we'll see what happens. There's going to be a new Federal Reserve chair coming up, an appointment here in a few years. I think President Trump may want to go in a different direction. But what we need fundamentally, nationally, to get us out from this kind of slow growth, low interest rate situation that we've had since 2008 is we need economic growth. We haven't seen 1/4 of 3% economic growth since the beginning of the Obama administration. This last quarter that the numbers were announced today was 2.6%. So we're starting to get there, but it's going to take a commitment to tax relief. It's going to take a commitment to regulatory relief at the federal level to kind of get this back in whack. And I think, just depending on the Federal Reserve to take care of our problems and keeping rates artificially low is not the answer. What we need is dynamic economic growth and more productivity.
Over here.
Yes, thank you. The points you made regarding spending and taxation lead me to the middle of just what you mentioned is growth. My dad was a banker, a community banker, and I took economics 101. The theories that I learned about keeping local money growing in the local economy, I look at that with respect to how we define growth. A lot of the economic activity in the area that I live in, northeast Wichita, finds its way out to Best Buy, to other large anchors, states. And it just exacerbates me that we can't find more local ownership that has an interest that's more locally to put money to work back in the community rather than in Missouri and other real estate investment trusts and such. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's a competition for these kind of jobs. There's a competition for this economic activity. And we've got to make sure that people have a reason to create jobs here versus out of state. We have to make sure that they have economic opportunity here versus out of state. And that's one of the core pieces of why we need a reset on making Kansas more competitive again, is we need to make sure those high-paying jobs are being created here versus St. Louis or Oklahoma City. And same thing we're seeing internationally on the national playing field is there is no reason, folks, this is economic malpractice, that we have American companies going overseas for lower taxes and becoming foreign companies just for the idea that they want lower taxes. Burger King, perfect example. They are now a Canadian company. And it's not because Canadians love Whoppers that much more than Americans love Whoppers. They went for tax reasons, right? And the same principle at the state level is why are companies creating jobs in Texas and Florida and Arizona and North Carolina and not in New York, California, and Illinois? there's pretty two clear models here, a conflict of visions among states. And to grow jobs locally, we need to make sure we get those principles right for the reset.
One last question.
Okay, you indicated that savers haven't done that well in this economy, and it's true if you put your money in a savings institution, but the stock market seems to have done really well during this. And so if you had your retirement, for example, invested in the stock market, it looks like on the surface, it's done pretty well. Is there some piece of that we're not seeing or don't understand?
Well, right. I mean, so it depends on your horizon. If you timed it right and got in after the crash and then have ridden this last ride up on the stock market, you've done pretty well for yourself. Congratulations if you timed it right. You know, a lot of people were there in 2008 and 2007 and 2009 where we had the weak stock market years where their 401ks turned into 201ks. And all of a sudden then they were starting from, 20% or 25% down. And to get 25% making up, it takes a lot of investment returns over time to make that up, because it's the old 5th grade math trick. When you lose 30% and then gain 30% back, are you where you started? No, you got a ways to go. And so here's the other thing is the big challenge with the stock market today is price to earnings ratios are a bit out of whack historically. There's a lot of people saying we're seeing a new kind of bubble develop in equities and real estate in certain markets. But here's the thing that I think if I were President Trump would worry me a lot, and if I were Congress would worry me a lot, is that after President Trump was elected in November, after Republicans won both houses of Congress in November, the market priced in the idea that there would be fundamental tax relief and that there would be regulatory relief and we would have policies that would move us towards 3 or 4% economic growth again as a nation. That is priced into the market. You know how expectations work. The stock market roared after November, and that period from November through January or February was an amazing period for the equities market. Here's the challenge. If Republicans who are in majority in Congress and in the White House now don't deliver on those promises that have been baked into the markets, look out, because I think that we're going to see a big problem with equities markets if tax relief and if regulatory relief aren't completed in Washington. So that's a challenge, is Republicans now and conservatives in Congress have their mantle ahead of them that they need to deliver on the promises that they campaigned on. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be with you.